Call this Planning Commission special meeting to order this Tuesday, August the 2nd at 4:30. May I have a roll call, please?
Chairman Amanda Denmark.
Here.
Vice Chairman Charlie Whitmore.
Here.
Commissioner Kathleen Duncan.
Here.
Commissioner Jim Flynn.
Here.
Commissioner Lydia DePaul.
Here.
Commissioner Rich Delcor. Commissioner Jason Stewart.
Notice regarding adjournment. I hope we don't have this problem. The Planning Commission will not hear new items after 9:30 unless authorized by majority vote of the commission members present. Items which have not been heard before 9:30 may be continued to the next regular meeting or a special meeting date as determined by the commission members. Notice regarding public comments. Every member of the public who is recognized to speak shall address the chairman, and in speaking, avoid disrespect to commission, staff, and other members of the meeting. State your name and address when speaking for the record. Comments are limited to 3 minutes. May I have an adoption of the agenda, please?
So moved.
And do I have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Are there any public comments for items not on the agenda?
All of them are for the agenda.
Do we have any old business? Do we have any new business? We just have discussion. Number 1, workshop to discuss the land use and housing elements from Blueprint Bluffton and update long-range comprehensive plan for the town of Bluffton. Charlotte, would you please start the presentation or introduction?
Thank you. Once again, we're going to review 2 chapters or elements of our draft comprehensive plan, and the discussion will be led by Kyle May, our consultant from MKSK, all the way in Columbus, Ohio. So, Kyle, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Just really quickly, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, we'll go ahead and get started here. Want to thank everybody again for this this time as we've begin to tour and work our way through the overall plan. We remember quickly we've got 10 elements that are included in the work that we're doing, 10 categories. We've traversed 4 of those so far, gathered great notes, I think, from you all, both in terms of your PDF comments that you've left and in terms of the conversation. Today we want to tackle a couple of big and pretty important chapters within the plan, talking about housing and land use, 2 very interrelated topics, as I think you've seen and understand through your work there with the commission. Interested to dive in, I think, with you all into some discussion around these chapters, and also talking a little bit directly about some of the comments that I've received from you, from staff, and way we can iterate each of these chapters moving forward. So like previous meetings, I'd like to start just do a quick screen share, go over our agenda, and then very quickly transition and open up for some discussion here with the group. So this is our 3rd meeting. Remember, we've got another meeting coming up here on Thursday, where we're going to be talking about natural resources and resiliency. Remember, resiliency is a new chapter this go around in terms of our comprehensive planning effort. But tonight we're really focused on land use and, as I mentioned, on housing. Just a quick reminder, those of you that might be tuning in from the public, with each of these sessions, we're looking to talk a little bit about some of the comments that we've received thus far, provide a brief summary of those comments, have some discussion around some key areas within each of the chapters, and ultimately arrive at some actions, a pathway to address, revise, and the key word I used, iterate, this document, the plan, moving closer and closer to our final piece of work. So in terms of our overall agenda, really quickly, just in terms of, we've got August 4th coming up, obviously that's in a couple of days, but also our final session together in this series on August 10th, where we're going to talk about economics and that closing chapter to the overall plan, which is that priority and investments section. So looking forward to each of those with you all. Quickly though, before we do jump into this, I just want to let you know that we've not been sitting sitting on our hands, I think, since our previous discussion. So we're working hard to integrate your comments on those previous 4 chapters. Quite a bit that was shared and some good conversation as well. So based on those proposed actions and indeed working with staff, we're working to develop the next round of each of those chapters as we work through each of these conversations. So we're not necessarily waiting, I think, to get through the full 10 to then start at the beginning and make the changes. We're really indeed jumping into this while it remains fresh. So I want to begin tonight's conversation again with your permission, with some discussion around land use. Obviously, this is quite a critical chapter, not just for this plan, but also for your work moving forward. You'll remember that in our previous sessions, we've got 3 kind of categories of comments that I want to uplift and then kind of unpack and discuss as part of this work. Starting from the lowest and going up, simple comments. Remember, those are things that we've noticed as recurring themes in this chapter. We're going to address. We feel like we've got the direction from those comments to be able to address them without a whole lot of discussion. But we want to make sure that you are aware that we've documented that. We're going to move forward. We're going to make that change. Subjective pieces. Those are areas where either from some discussion with you all or discussion with staff, or stakeholders for that matter, we could use a little bit of help just on the perspective, point of view, level of altitude, whatever it might be, for that particular set of comments. So we want to make sure that those are uplifted here. We have some discussion. And last, but absolutely not least, are the substantial pieces. And that just means that those are comments that we've received. There's some resonance around those comments. A few people have mentioned them, where as a group, we want to sharpen our pencils, go back in and do some good editing, some good additions, some good work to address what is a lacking component within the chapter that you have identified thus far. So, with that said, the land use chapter covers quite a bit of ground. Obviously, we're talking about what is literally on the ground, today in terms of existing conditions. We're talking about development patterns. We're talking a little bit about some of the peculiarities of your community, not necessarily with around the Low Country, but in terms of around the country and as it relates to planned development that's occurred over the eras of growth and development in the town. But we're also providing some thoughts around the future land use, future land use map, thinking about the growth framework and how that is articulated in terms of policy moving forward. And last but not least, also taking some liberties and zooming in on a couple of areas where we think there's either particular interest. We've received comments about these areas and trying to think about, whether it's policy or it is indeed project, what is the right next chapter or continued investment for these particular areas. And then like all chapters where this gets back to the kind of the regular rhythm, we have our action agenda, at the end. So with that, I wanted to introduce, we didn't have a whole lot of comments in either of these chapters here today, but I was hoping, to have some discussion, even in just around the topic, to see if, there are some key issues or trends that you'd like to, for me to uplift in the work. Within land use, one of the key things I think that was reflected by your comments is the idea that we are sourcing images within the chapter, either that are within the community today or that accurately reflect the kind of the character, the scale, the massing, the architecture of the type of community Bluffton may be 5 years, 10 years on from today. I think a big question, though, that comes to mind as we address that piece, and this is a bit subjective, and I'm going to put it back to you for some discussion, is thinking about, what are the right benchmark communities or aspirational communities if it's not an image that comes from self-reference, meaning there's an example of that type of development pattern in Bluffton today. I'd be interested if there's any communities right now that you all as leaders kind of look to and say, they're doing something right, there's something about the way they operate, the architecture, whatever it might be, that you've heard maybe from constituents or from other community members, that ought to be reflected in this plan. Any thoughts on that comment?
I hate to put it this way, but that's a great question that I wish we had thought to ask last week. I'd be more than happy to be prepared to answer that at the next meeting. A model community that would be something we'd be like, but, I mean, trying to think of it off the cuff.
But we're different than like just a cookie cutter community or a new age. I mean, we have a mixture of different characteristics and styles. I mean, it's all southern, low country, but then there's things are going to some of the more low country modern. I mean, there's all different realms of it. So I don't think there's a specific development pattern that we're.
No, but I wonder if there are communities that are of kind of a mixture of old, historic, but they're developing growth around them like we are.
Like, I haven't been to, like, and maybe you have, Lydia, like Rosemary Beach, that area, because I know that they have a lot of interesting beach, southern architecture from different styles of different regions.
There's a couple places in Florida that have some interesting and well-designed.
Seaside
Yeah. I would say, for me, some of the issues with the images are like the estate lot, for example. If we're talking about 1 unit per acre or 1 unit ideally per 3 acres, then let's show a home on some land that's not directly at the street and isn't just a front-facing garage, suburban, could have been built anywhere in the country.
Exactly.
I think some of the images in the more commercial areas are more of a city scale. So even just finding images that are appropriate with what we've done either in the promenade or in Buckwalter or kind of those type. We're trying to keep everything pedestrian focused,
Right.
and just the scale of some of the images feels off. I think there's also, I'm sure, some communities around Charleston and other South Carolina locations, places around Savannah. I mean, for exact references, I don't have them at the moment, but I think
The architectural characteristics would be
Yes.
from these southern coastal towns.
Yeah.
And some of these images just are like, from anywhere. So
Yeah.
it needs to be more representative of that, because that's kind of the growth too off of the coast, and it kind of goes outward. So it's going to be that more coastal feel the closer. And then, as you gradually go out, you're going to have some other styles mixed into it. But it's not going to be like that suburban middle America plop down in a neighborhood kind of feel.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense, I think, Gang. And I do appreciate the comment about, being prepared a little bit more to answer this question. I just want to ensure all of you, I think, trying to open up some discussion here tonight. So, I think on to that point, if there are sort of specific examples, I think that you'd like to see reflected, especially if we think about some of these aspirational character types, that's going to be helpful. I think what I'm hearing, though, this idea of old and new, someone mentioned Seaside in there, which is, obviously a contrived place, right? But it has a feeling of history. But also thinking around the Low Country, South Carolina, and what is going on the coast. I think one of the areas where we certainly missed the mark in that section has to do with the commercial character representation. I hear that comment loud and clear, that we can work harder. There are plenty of precedent, developments, I think, that are both at scale, but also I think reflect some of the attention to detail when it comes to materials, massing, aesthetics, visual complexity, and at the same time, I think also reflect some of the, not, I want to say laid back nature, but we've described Bluffton over these series of meetings in a very specific way. And I think what we can do within that chapter especially is find communities that also, play in the same vernacular, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, because even, in the Old Town district versus outside of Old Town, the other parts of Bluffton all over, Old Town's commercial scale is quite different than all the other commercial scales, and it's not big box, it's not big metal buildings, it's more of a pedestrian residential scale versus a large massing. And so, like, even in the promenade, they're the largest buildings we have in the downtown, but it's but it still has the correct scale. And it's just not like some of these pictures kind of like just a large, flat facade.
I think the other note I take in this is also a lack of green in some of those photos, right?
Yeah.
If you're anything as a community, even in some of your newer development, there's a significant investment in landscaping and in ensuring that green piece remains, even if it's new development. So I think as we show these, we just want to make sure that it doesn't look like the kind of density or massing that you might find in a place where that's not a priority. I also noticed that.
And that goes kind of back to like when Lydia's talking about, just garages in the front. And yes, there are neighborhoods like that, but in general, like if we can preserve the nature and the trees, you don't want to have to clear cut everything either and enjoy the beauty of what we have. So I don't know if there's,
No doubt.
so the imagery isn't just all, when you get to housing, not to say that you have that, but that it isn't all like front-facing, one after the other cookie cutter things, that there are some unique characteristics. And even in some of the neighborhoods, they're trying to be, to have different facades throughout and trying to incorporate some of the low country.
And just because we have a lot of PUDs doesn't mean that it's all literally cookie cutter, copy paste. Some of the places are like that, but I don't think that's a goal to aspire to. And we do have neighborhoods within PUDs where everything or many things are custom and different and focused on the scale and the massing and the detailing, and a lot less focus on the garage doors and a lot more on the front door and kind of with yards and trees and other things too. And we have examples of that in Bluffton that I'm sure we could get images for.
That's actually a really good point. I think as we think about the planned communities, one of the interesting things about the planned communities is kind of the attention to detail that you see, even as compared to some tract home development that we have more commonly around the country. In developing out that plan, a master plan, you really have an opportunity to consider building a holistic neighborhood. And I think that is we see that executed at varying levels, right, of course, but that is an interesting character type. I think we bring up the PUD piece, as you guys well know, just to talk about what parts of the community have maybe it's lowercase e, but been entitled, meaning like we have been through a planning process. We have approved a plan for that work. Now there's obviously there's ongoing changes that can occur long term. But I think what we bring that up is just, again, it's an area where you're a bit unique. And I think in terms of communicating some of the key facts, about community, especially within the confines of this chapter, just we view it as critical to bring that up. One item that I would bring up from a previous discussion has to do, with the nature of the planning area per se, meaning that lasso that we were doing, our research and work, around. So I just wanted to make sure that you're still aware that those comments are captured by our team. And I think working with staff, trying to determine the right pathway about whether, one, how we define that thing, meaning how did we arrive, at this boundary, or two, considering, which areas may be included or maybe strategically not included within this, or included with a very strong caveat that says, we're doing this work for the purposes of analysis, but there's no assumption that, recommendations are being made on top of these existing areas. Are there any, you've had a chance, I think, to think about that for a couple of weeks. Are there any more thoughts on just the planning area concept within the work?
Well, I think I had the strongest feelings on that, so if y'all don't mind.
Go ahead.
I don't have a challenge per se with areas like Alljoy being included in the study area, but I truly believe that we need to have a different hatching, a different coloring, something within it saying that there is no intent to annex nor make this a part of the town. It was just done for a purpose of extending the overall character of what's already there that we like as part of what's going on. Because like I said before, I mean, I've only been here for 31 years, and for 31 years, I've been hearing that Bluffton is trying to annex Alljoy, and it's never been true. And so it's a tough thing that we need to make clear every chance we get.
Commissioner, in addition to Alljoy, are there any other places or sub-neighborhoods that we ought to be aware of and kind of treat with a similar treatment, in that plan?
Can any of you think of anything? I can't think of anything that's beyond there that's an issue.
Okay.
I mean, it's ironic because we couldn't annex them even if we wanted to with the South Carolina laws, and we don't want to, so.
Sure.
Did you have something, Kathleen?
Did the previous annexation area, well, actually technically current, the current comprehensive plan outlines an area of annexation, at least I believe it's in the comprehensive plan, maybe I'm incorrect about that, but it does identify an area of annexation. I'm wondering, does it include the Alljoy area? If anybody, Charlotte, you may or may not know that off the top of your head. And two, is that something that we could consider putting in here is, there's a study land use area that we're looking at, but then actually go through the process of identifying that potential annexation area.
I don't believe it is, but I would need to look for certain.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if because that could help clarify us if, one, even if the previous annexation map included the Alljoy area, we could then parcel that out, cut that off, so that's no longer a question. But that just including that map in here clarifies we're not looking to annex it, we're just looking at it as a part of the bigger picture.
Yeah. I also wonder, and kind of part of this conversation sparks a piece for me, which in a lot of plans, I'll typically outline how annexation actually occurs in your state, meaning like what's the actual process to do that. Again, this is really just a bit of information. It's not policy. But just like we would provide, information in other chapters, it may be of interest to a reader to determine or to see, like, this is exactly how that works, right, in South Carolina. Here's who needs to be involved. Property owner, whatever that might look like. I think if we had maybe it's a sidebar style paragraph, but we had some information in there about just how that's worked, especially as the community's grown significantly through that process. What's typical there. You think that would help a little bit here? I mean, just in terms of just base communication here.
Can't hurt.
Can't hurt. I think it'd be good.
I mean, I'm not even sure you need to fully outline it, but as long as you make reference to, if there's a source that identifies that clearly, that process clearly, I think that would be sufficient, which could be included as part of that, as part of an annexation map of what could be annexed in the town of Hilton Head or town of Bluffton versus what cannot be included as a part of the town of Bluffton.
Sure. So it's the idea of the potentially annexable versus off the table, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. That's very helpful. One other thing I just wanted to lift up, in this chapter, and not closing the door on this by any means here this evening. So just like with the other topics, I think if you all have thoughts that flower, out of our discussion, I really want you to feel comfortable very quickly sharing them with me. There was a note toward the rear of this section around defining or differentiating the terms affordable and workforce housing, which obviously if you looked at those like on a Venn diagram, there's a pretty big overlap between A and B, but they are different. And they are, in the case of our work, especially this chapter we're going to talk about here in a second with housing, in need of some better clarification. So that's something that I wanted to make sure that we added into this next go round, and also make sure that we hit directly on the head, within that housing chapter. Any comments on the housing bit? shaking your head no. All I can see is myself. I'm sorry. There you are.
Can
Kyle,
you
are
repeat
you-
that? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Are you referencing it as part of one of the recommendations under land use? Is that what when you're talking about the affordable versus workforce?
Yes, I believe I am. There was a note, I think it's on L1.4, review workforce affordable housing requirements. As a provision, there was a note in there, I believe it was by you, Commissioner, to make sure that we define what those two mean, or maybe the term is differentiate, not necessarily define, but do both, define and differentiate.
Yeah, and I think because the housing section actually comes before this, as long as you differentiate that and define that in the housing section, I don't know that you need to go through the extra effort in here
Okay.
other than specifically apply those definitions and how that relates to the land use section of it. Like how
Yeah.
much
But
percentage,
somewhere,
what
yeah.
percentage of our total housing should be affordable and what percentage should be workforce, application, things like of that nature.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, we can certainly do that. And I caught that note also in the I guess the sister chapter to this within housing as well. So we would certainly make sure that that is well defined. As you guys know, we'll get into this when we talk about housing, but there's a lot of implied synonyms within that conversation that aren't quite synonyms, right? Low income housing, affordable housing, workforce, they do mean different things. So we want to make sure, and a couple of those terms are relative to where you are, right? One of them is sort of a federal definition. So just want to make sure that we are talking about the right thing when we are talking about it. So it's an important point. I'm glad someone made that comment.
Has there been any?
Well, like I said, there weren't a huge amount of comments in this section, but I did want to just see if there's any open discussion, about the land use topic in general. It's, one that we get excited to discuss as nerdy planners, but anything just, I think, general, you'd like to discuss within this particular section?
Lydia has something she wanted to.
Has there been any further discussions between you and staff about the town hall presentation regarding current land use, future land use, and PUD build out? And if so, where are we with that?
I'm sorry, I had a little trouble hearing that comment or question.
Have you and staff had a chance to review the town hall maps about PUD build out and future land use and current land use in Bluffton that are not part of the comp plan but are part of the town hall presentation?
I'm sorry. Yes, that presentation was shared with me, Charlotte. I believe you shared that as part of the previous. If I'm thinking of the correct, document, that build out analysis was shared with me. I believe there was some comment during the previous session about the numbers within that plan. Again, that was not part of this process explicitly, but it's obviously been brought to my attention. I'm sorry, I can't really comment beyond that. Charlotte, I'm not sure if you have anything to elaborate on with that piece.
Yeah, I've started to look through that. So Kevin and I will take a look at those numbers and work with Kyle, and I believe we had a public comment about that too. So I am reviewing that right now, and we'll make sure that we have that corrected in the plan.
I think what the confusion is, if I'm reading it right when I went back through it, is the numbers that are used for the housing is in units, and the numbers that are used for commercial is in acres. And so it's a percentage of acreage plus a percentage of units and dividing it out, and that's not entirely accurate because you're dealing with apples and oranges, not apples and apples. So I know you all are on that, but I'd be curious to see what you come up with and how you get there as well.
Agreed. I just think there's a pretty big discrepancy between that document and this document. And I know the math is probably not quite correct on that document, but with such a huge discrepancy, we need to know all of that information to be able to wrap up this document and kind of move forward. in terms of build out and land use. And I think it's just confusing that we're kind of presenting the town hall info quite differently than this. So wherever that resolves, please keep us posted.
Commissioner DePaul, I appreciate that comment. And I think working with Charlotte, we want to make sure we reconcile, those numbers, especially making sure they're apples to apples in here. I think that one of the critical things to stress, and I think we need to do this better in the plan, and underlining it, is looking at the planning area versus the town specifically. And there will be some discrepancy between A and B, and I think that's more to do with how we approach the analysis on our side. But very minimum, which you point out, we need to reconcile that. So certainly that's a high note on my list. Thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, Kyle, you want me to go ahead and open up for a public comment discussion? Are you good with that? Can you hear?
Absolutely.
Okay. Is there anyone that has any, Carrie?
Well, they're all about housing, so do you want to
Okay.
the housing now, or do you want to wait till after Kyle talks about it?
I do have a general comment as well.
For land use? Okay, so we'll just wait on the housing one then.
I would make a comment on land use.
Okay.
Well, okay, we have one comment and then Commissioner Whitmore wants.
Okay, if you'll come up.
Okay, never mind, we've got a couple.
You're late.
Okay, please state your name and address for the record.
Joe DePaul, 36 3rd Avenue. Just a thought on land use, and forgive me if this is too late in the process here, but my big land use pet peeve in the town of Bluffton is what are the Bluffton and Buckwalter parkways, and how do we want them developed moving into the future? Right now, there's an awful lot of storage units that are just right up on the road on the Parkway. A lot of it isn't developed yet, but as you come off the island, it's the back of Tanger and the back of Tanger and some woods and some utility easements, and then it kind of turns into a lot of parking lots that we're not building to the Parkway. Kind of parking lots in front of buildings. We're not really screening it in the way that Hilton Head does. There's not a really big, generous buffer, and it's not all kind of hidden behind the trees and natural. So we call them parkways, but what is that? How do we want to guide development on those in the future? Do we want more of what we've got? Or do we want to see those trees start going away because they're quote-unquote civiculture and those lots get clear-cut and we end up a lot of open space and a lot less green on the parkways than we do in other parts of town, like Old Town. And even like New Riverside still maintains a tree canopy pretty well, but the parkways themselves kind of feel like a in-between nowhere place right now that I think could be improved upon in the next 10 years.
Thank you.
Carol Crutchfield.
If I could really quickly on Mr. DePaul's comment, I appreciate the idea of applying character typology to those streets, especially as we start to call them parkways. That term means something, right? In transportation planning, and that may be a soft point I think that we could address, and I think it probably fits in mostly in the transportation section as a piece that we can influence with our partners around the county and indeed the state. But also, that right-of-way conversation impacts the character of the outside the right-of-way discussion, the real estate. So I appreciate that. We'll look at that, Mr. Paul. Thank you.
Name?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Next one. Okay.
Hi, I'm Carol Crutchfield. I'm the facilities planner for the Beaufort County School District here again. So land use, I'm sorry I got here late. We had Summer Institute training for all our teachers today. Yay! Anyway, so I missed the discussion. But again, I think I touched on this before at previous meetings, but I can't say it enough. If you can include in your thought and planning, even in generically saying, we need to keep in mind that land is needed for schools and parks and recreation and things for our students. That's really just kind of what I wanted to continue to say, and as many times as I can, I'm always talking about land and a need for land, and we're trying to purchase land, and land is hard to come by. So if it can be in the forefront, if it's in a planning blueprint document that we're going to be looking for the next 10 years, then it's something we need to continue to keep in mind, because we still have a lot more to grow, as you all know. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Well, that's a really good point. That should be in this chapter, Kyle, is, we may not be able to identify land because that makes it infinitely more expensive for whoever buys it for the schools, but we can talk about the concept in the land use chapter.
Yes. Awesome.
All right, did you have something else?
Yes. If you've got it in front of you, if you can go to 125, and I know I mentioned this back when we had the initial meeting, this is the current growth framework map. I don't know if you can pull it up, Charlotte, or no, we don't have it hooked up tonight.
I can pull it up.
Yeah. There are a couple things on there that I'm personally having challenges with, and that is, in the 2007 plan, we discussed, I don't know if it was part of the plan yet because it was all so new out there, but the three major nodes were to be Old Town, Buckwalter Place, and New Riverside. And New Riverside on this map is listed as less of a major node, although it is surrounded, when it's all done, it'll be surrounded by over 11,000 homes. And that's if you don't include Palmetto Bluff. So that needs to be a major node. And the other thing that I was having a challenge with, I actually misread, so forget that. If you go back to page 124 before that, I would suggest on subject F, says acknowledge the gravitational pull of Old Town. I would almost change that to acknowledge the gravitational pull of the major nodes in town. And we need to start thinking about how they are drawing from the communities that are immediately around them and how they're drawing from further out. So Old Town will draw from just outside of Old Town, but it'll draw from Buckwalter, New Riverside. People in Old Town will go to New Riverside to the barn park that's getting developed and so on. And that will probably play into transportation as well. But for land use, I would suggest that. And then the other one I personally am having a challenge with is, if you go back to the map for a second, and you see on the left-hand side where it says study area, just to the right of that is the intersection of 170 and Bluffton Parkway. That should be developed as, or that should be tagged as some type of node. It's, and I said this before, and I don't want to rehash everything, but Bluffton Parkway is eventually going to become exit 3 on I-95. And that is going to end up being a commercial node in the town. And this comprehensive plan identifies it as a potential large housing node, possibly helping with affordable and workforce housing, which may be okay, it may not be, but as an entryway into the town, it seems to me that that makes more sense keeping it a commercial mode, which is what it's pegged for now. And on the flip side, we don't always agree on everything, but Ms. Crutchfield and I agree on not adding more housing units to this town if we don't have to. And so if we're talking about workforce and affordable housing, where are those units coming from if we're just creating them out of what is now commercial space? So those were my challenges with the map, and things that we need to think through, I think.
Well, I appreciate those comments, Commissioner. You can see me, making our notes here live into the PDF. I think I agree. I think on each of those, and those are things we can pick up in this next version.
We have another public comment. Please state your name and address for the record.
Andrew Keel, 22 Trail Ridge Retreat, Bluffton, South Carolina. I was just curious. I've become informed that Hardyville is developing some insane number of houses, or has been approved, something like 9,500. So we're talking about land use, and you're talking about the nodes, where there might obviously all those people are not going to Hardyville to eat because there's nothing to eat there other than a Burger King, I think. They're probably going to be coming to Bluffton. So would it be wise to potentially think about making more commercial area over there by, 278, where whatever the part of town, Bluffton is, which I think kind of ends where 278 and 170, is any of that available to become commercial that should potentially try to, I don't know.
Be incorporated and
Yeah, because it might, everybody's going to flow to what we have further this way if there's nothing out that way. So I don't know, and I'm not sure, but I wanted to throw that in.
It's an interesting point. There isn't much town of Bluffton land there, unfortunately. There is Seagrass Station, which has a commercial component to it, but pretty much everything else is county. And I know they are paying attention to that area, and they're going to have to do some major traffic improvements there.
Yeah. You see the explosive growth in your region. It's obviously being absorbed not just by you all, but by a number of communities, I think. And some of you guys have amenities that were gifted, through previous eras, and some of you may not. And you're right, Andrew, to bring up the kind of the cross movement that creates. The Buckwalter Parkway, or excuse me, the Bluffton Parkway, and the extension over, as you rightly bring up, Commissioner, to the freeway, and what that would mean. That's obviously a big deal, I think, for you all, and you know that. And I'm preaching the choir here, but I think as you think about the facilitation of movement, it's not just toward the interstate; it's also back toward, Bluffton, whether it's Buckwalter or beyond, or even some of that node that you just pointed out, Commissioner. So, I think each of those points is an important one that we make sure that we have underlined in this work, especially within this chapter.
Well, and to throw onto that, just as you were talking, the thought process continues when that is done, whenever that is done, whether it's 5 years or 15 or 20 years, and that becomes exit 3. Now everybody that lands at Hilton Head Bluffton or Hilton Head Savannah Airport comes up 46 through the traffic circle and hopefully up 170. Once that's done, everybody's going to come up Bluffton Parkway. So that's going to be a major traffic shift in the town. I don't know that it's something we address in this comp plan, but it's something that's going to happen.
Sure. It has a direct relationship to land use too, right? I think that's the key point. And we talk about these sections being interrelated, but nothing affects land use like transportation and access. So, we just want to make sure. I think that point's not being hit. We hit it harder.
I have one more
Are
question.
there any? Yeah, absolutely. Go. I'm sorry.
We had a public comment at a previous meeting that was mentioning the potential for master plans expiring in the state of South Carolina. I wasn't sure if staff has had any time to look into that, or if that's if there's truth to that, because as for L 2.2, I think we talk about how we may need to renegotiate some PUD agreements. If master plans do expire, that would be very relevant to that conversation. And if so, what are those dates?
I know one little answer to this. So for example, Buckwalter PUD is on its 11th amendment. And when the revisions are done and so on, that adds 25 years to it.
25.
Yes, so I believe Buckwalter expires in 2039, if I'm right.
but if they amend it starts over.
If they amend it, it starts the clock over. But that's the
just
very
right.
little I know about expiration.
And who can amend it? Like, do they have to come back to the town?
Whenever we do, like,
Master plan
what's
amendment?
the master plan amendment we're looking at? I don't know.
Cypress Ridge.
Well, midpoint, master plan
Yeah.
amendment. If it's opened up and it's amended, that starts the clock all over again.
So I guess my question would
Commissioner-
be, can we
Sorry, go
include
ahead.
with our planning existing, at least at the time of the comprehensive plan, what those expiration dates are presently?
Mr. Keel has another question
I
or
would have been
comment.
disappointed if you didn't have something to say.
Andrew Keel, 22 Trail Ridge Retreat. I don't know what that, I think with respect to all this, and I'm not sure this has ever been a focus, and I've never been in meetings until
to all of our planning meetings.
Yeah. And I think the town needs to get a hold on what are expiration times and things like that for all these plans and start potentially adhering to them, or at least figuring out, because at the planning commission meeting the other day, Mr. Town Council gave a fairly ambiguous answer, which I think his answer was, well, we treat this as PUDs, whatever the expiration time on PUDs is what the expiration time on anything associated with it, being development plans, master plans, things like that. And I mentioned that there is potentially a loophole, like in all good legislation, a loophole, which is the health, safety, and welfare of the community. And when you look at the statute that all this PUDs are based on, there is a section in there. And I kind of got tired of writing memos, so I haven't written one for this meeting. But there are potentially ways to, I think, negotiate this. Of course, nobody's going to like it, but there are loopholes. And with respect to the master plan, again, there is a 5-year expiration in the UDO under 3.9 whatever for master plans with a caveat of something. But, you know, I think it'd be wise to get a hold on what are the time limits on these things, as opposed to just defaulting to the PUD time limit of 25 years plus another 5 years plus another 5 years. That's just my comment.
That's a good idea.
Well, and there is a difference between PUDs and the UDO. The UDO handles what's not in a PUD. So,
Well, if I could, I think in the PUD documents, when I read, like, for example, the New Riverside one, I haven't read any of the others. The New Riverside puts it tells what documents are governing. Quite honestly, I have a hard time figuring out what the UDO actually the current UDO that's like on the website, what that applies to, because it starts with the development plan, I think it goes to the statute, and then there's 4 or 5 others, and whenever everybody's revising a master plan, they refer to Exhibit F or whatever of the PUD development agreement, which is section 5.88, which is a exhibit part of the document. But anyhow, in that 5.8 thing, they do not put any time limits, but it also says that section is if I'm remembering correctly, the minimum standards. So I don't know why things couldn't be added to it. But anyhow, I'm not the town attorney, but I think it would be wise to try to just get a hold on what the time limits are, as opposed to defaulting to 25, 30 years plus 2 5-year extensions.
and I think we're getting a little side off track here, but it is a fascinating conversation about the laws for PUDs in South Carolina and how they apply and what you can do once one is signed and how you're stuck with it or not stuck with it. But that's also part of what we count on staff for, is telling us legally what we can and can't do. And, but anyways.
To Mr. Keel's point, one of the things that I think would be helpful in this document is a map of the PUDs and where the UDO applies. And it would be useful on that map to see what percentage of build out we have as it pertains to those PUDs, and even include the expiration dates. Be a useful map.
A nice map.
One of the things I struggle with is this figure 8.1 on page 120 that shows all of that undeveloped open space, which is substantial when you're looking at the total land use area for town of Bluffton. And there's not a map that shows me where that's at. Now, I happen to know a lot of that's probably in Palmetto Bluff, but seeing where those areas, I mean, when you look at the future land use map and you compare it with the existing land use map, it gives you a pretty good idea of that undeveloped open space, where that's at. But you have to look really closely, and by the way, it looks really green. So you think, oh, Bluffton's so pretty and green. And then if you compare it with the future land use map, do you realize how much green is now gone?
Exactly.
So mapping this, and you have the information. It's not that it's not there. You can clearly see
Right.
the difference between the existing and the future. So that would be a useful tool in terms of understanding how we're developing. And then the other part of that that's going to feed that narrative is understanding the density. Because, as you well know, a lot of Palmetto Bluff are these estate lots. So they're not highly dense, they just take up a lot of area. So I don't know if there's a way that we can apply this undeveloped open space map and some kind of a density pattern in terms of where are the people most compactly going to be. Because I think that that's part of a conversation piece of, back to Mr. Wetmer's point, where do we want those townhomes, that middle housing to go, the duplexes and the apartments, so we can start looking at what that balance really means in the terms of the scope of our development area.
If I can just add one more thing to that, I think it would be very helpful if we had, I appreciate the different legends on the future and the existing land use maps and that they're showing me different things, but it would be really helpful to have existing and future with both identical legends for the two different ways that you're showing it, so that they are essentially apples to apples. The colors mean the same thing, and we can kind of see what's developed and what's proposed for development, because they have similar colors, but the colors are, like, the legend isn't the same, which makes it very hard to compare. I think it would be helpful if they both were speaking the same language, and maybe we need both versions of it, future and existing, but I'm not sure that one is more important than the other in terms of the legend that you have. I think we need all of that information, but to have it side by side and in both consistent legends would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. I understand that point. I think being able to compare obviously is critical there. And we, each of those points that were just made previously, I think those are things we can, quite easily tackle and integrate. The one comment about undeveloped open space, you're right. That's a good point. I mean, it doesn't mean that's green in perpetuity, right? I mean, I think we're talking about high ground there. So I think if there's a way to code and then also to map that, I think we may be able to accomplish that within the existing land use, honestly. So I'm going to look at that and see what we can do. But if necessary, we may just need to make a new map. With the PUD comment in terms of mapping that, we've got a small exhibit to that effect that is on page 121. But I think within this, we could actually blow this up to be a more robust graphic to get at what I think is being discussed here in terms of not just where the PUDs are, but also the names of those PUDs, the expiry dates for each of them, and some notion around, a build out. Maybe if it's in percentage, it's in units, I'm not sure. The critical thing here, I think, driving a lot of this conversation is dwelling units. So I would be first inclined to include that information on there, like what's still in the hopper, you know what I mean, in terms of rooftops, and then build back, from that data.
I think a lot of that is going to be the coordination between that mobile town hall presentation that talks about that, if that data can get cleaned up and corrected. But I personally would be of the same thought that units is more valuable, especially as we're talking about schools, as we're talking about facilities, we need to kind of really understand how many more residents we're going to have. And so at least on the residential side, I would much prefer to see that in terms of units than a percentage of build out.
Yeah, and that's the currency we deal in, right, in planning is units, right? I mean, we don't know who's going to live in them eventually. We assume kind of the median family size will prevail. But as we start to think about projections, we have to think about real estate first and how those plans were prepared originally and entitled originally. And that's why, the unit question becomes the first piece we would do. The rest of those become assumptions based around that build out. So absolutely.
Well, and there is a slide that has some raw data on it in that presentation that includes expiration dates of PUDs. They need to be verified and updated if that needs to happen, as well as residential dwelling units allowed and built. And then, like I was saying before, the big challenge with commercial is it's per unit residential, per acre commercial. So there's no way
Right.
they need to be two separate, and that's probably what's going to happen to that town presentation is it'll be two separate things. You can't just kind of combine them and say, okay, it's 52% developed as a whole. But yeah, that raw data is in there. I don't know where they got it from, but I'm sure the town keeps pretty close track on all those numbers.
Excellent.
One other thought I have, I have many thoughts, but one thought I had, and this kind of relates to Chairman DePauw's, not Chairman, Commissioner DePauw's comments about, again, that comparison chart of existing land uses versus future land uses, because when it comes to the future land use plan, when you come to that town center, I think you lose on that future land use map so much of what's really happening downtown and what we really want to see downtown in terms of commercial product, in terms of civic product, in terms of parks, things like that. And so when you blow up the downtown, but all it is just a big giant dark blue blob, that's not super helpful. So this may go back to kind of what she was saying, if apples to apples comparison, that may help kind of clarify some of what's happening on this future land use map.
Yeah. I take that point, Commissioner. I think one of the difficulties we have in doing that transition from existing land use to the future land use conversation is as we've created the map that you're seeing, especially around the future, we're really trying to think in terms of development character districts, right? Which gets out of the kind of the granular parcel by parcel discussion and really tries to lasso places that have a like feel. And obviously, one of the key things that makes Old Town is the kind of the eclectic nature of use, the interaction of complementary uses, meaning residential, commercial, those pieces. So I think what we're trying to do, obviously we can iterate this significantly, but we're trying to communicate that it is that kind of integrated piece that makes that place special. And the description is trying to get along that as well. But I certainly take your point. Trying to make that clearer, I think, in the graphic, we can work harder on that.
I mean, I just think it's hard to understand. I mean, I know there's a lot of parcels within Old Town we're talking about infilling, and what I'm looking at is something on my existing land use map that gives me a pretty strong idea of where commercial is versus residential product and where my parks are, and I've got no idea what's really going to happen with all of that infill moving forward. Is that looking like all red as we go along May River Road? Is that still spotty forms of, commercial that we've got here? Do we need to be looking at kind of pocketing some parks? And it just makes it really challenging when it's particularly this Old Town that I'm having a struggle with because, again,
Yeah.
we're blowing it up, but I have no idea. Like, we want to talk about so much about infill and how we're going to architect and shape and mold this Old Town, and yet I don't have any clear direction on what that should look like.
Yeah, and I think, Commissioner, again, not in any way trying to be defensive, on this particular piece, but as we talk about Old Town, and the complexity of that district and the nuance of each discussion that needs to occur as infill projects, especially, begin to be discussed, and then you get to more specific development plans. One of the recommendations within the staff had proposed that we had supported is really kind of revisiting that master guideline set, for that district in particular, as we think about kind of the lasso of, however you want to define the boundary for it, what are our guidelines? What are our standards? What is our mode of evaluating the character and contribution of each project? That development pressure in that zone is not going to abate. I mean, it's a place people want to be, right? And frankly, one of the difficulties of showing use on the parcels, you may have multiple uses on one, and that's kind of what contributes to the greatness of it. But I do take your point that that's an area that's just so critical, but it's like in all places, it's probably the hardest place to quickly define. You know what I mean? What makes it great? And I really do think it necessitates a closer, deeper, richer, look, in one that continues the legacy of previous work like that, if that makes any sense.
I think you make a great point, and referencing, staff's stance on this, where that master plan for Old Town has such a great weight. And I think that then shows the imperative of readdressing that master plan, because so much of our, like you said, there's so much growth and development pressure on that Old Town. If we don't get on that master plan quickly, it can spiral out of our control of really being able to capture what it is that we want. We've already compromised in so many ways in our Old Town, and I just think if we don't get on top of our master plan for Old Town fast, and like you said, that can and has provided our direction in the past, and I think that helps clarify at least my position. I think softens my position on giving that any more direction within this document.
But thanks, Commissioner. I've just seen, when you have issues that become, as zoomed in as those can become, it really does truly necessitate a process unto itself, involving experts in a wide range of fields. And that previous plan was very well executed, I would say, from my position. But I think things have changed even since that was, adopted. And, it's just critical to keep that legacy up. Keep that going. Being proactive, I should say.
Sure. I would say another thing on that future land use, that residential estate color and that suburban living color are just so close. And it becomes, to me, more problematic when you start looking at the areas that are outside of the town limits. I think it's a little easier to tell within those town limits, perhaps where those color variations are. But when you start 50% opacity or 80% opacity or whatever on the outside of our town limits, it becomes a little unclear as to what that means for those adjacent properties, whether they're residential, estate, or suburban living.
Fair point.
Additionally, I was looking at Palmetto Bluff, and this is really, I think, more pertaining to, well, I thought I saw it. I'm recalling it that I was looking at the future land use. There are some really dense parts of Palmetto Bluff that are identified as residential estate, which I think is kind of a bit of a misnomer. And I'm actually kind of curious, since we're going into some of these areas and giving a little more detail in terms of what's happening in there, I wonder if it's appropriate to also be looking at Palmetto Bluff, specifically because you're looking at where the big house is going on the south end, which is actually much more, like you've already previously identified, it's a much more of a node than this future land use map really details out or shows or demonstrates or gives an image of.
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, there are dense, actually the word is right. I think, relatively speaking, some dense development that's occurred, within that planned community to the south. Within the existing land use maps, you got to squint to see it. That's one of the problems with the geography being as large as it is. When we have the opportunity, I think within the web version of this, when you can actually zoom in and scroll through, be a little bit easier to view. But we do try to call that out, but it is within a sea of obviously residential that surrounds that development. I appreciate those comments, Commissioner.
And in essence of keeping time, so we have enough time for the other
Okay. I can
chapter.
provide more
Can you-
very specific comments. There's some very specific land use map comments, and I know I've not gotten my homework done, but I can provide much more detailed comments to finish this out, so that will address a majority of
Could
my.
type those out
Mm-hmm.
and then
Yeah,
get
I
those
just
to me.
haven't finished all my
That's okay.
homework.
Yeah, if you have any other comments, anyone, just type them out. But let's, just because it's, so we give enough time for the next chapter.
Sure.
You want to, if there are no other outstanding issues or items anyone wants to talk about regarding land use? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, great direction, team. I appreciate that. And yeah, as commissioners, you mentioned, if you do have follow-up, just share it with me, specific or otherwise. We need that information. So let's quickly move on to our other topic for this evening, which is dealing with housing. Another not small topic, I think, as we think about, our plan. Some minimal comments here within the draft as we reviewed it. However, I think there is a pretty significant discussion. Again, I told you how these things two relate, right? I mean, a pretty significant discussion as we use this phrase, this two-word phrase, build out, right? What does that mean? Especially within our conversation around the entitled development. And when I'm saying that, I'm really thinking about, the planned development, the planned unit development growth that has been approved, some of which has occurred, over years, some of which has occurred over more than a decade, in terms of construction, home building, commercial building, and eventually market absorption. You don't have any problem with that last piece, right? I mean, there's one of the things that I've looked into, as was noted in the previous session here, we talked about people, is who's coming to Bluffton, right? Who makes up this population? And it's actually really interesting as you dig into the IRS data around migration patterns to see that, number one, South Carolina is attracting more out-of-state migration than any other state in the United States. And your particular region is leading within South Carolina. Now, what does that mean on its face? Not much, but as you start to unpack the idea of how some of your base demographics have shifted over that same period, shifting wealthier, shifting older, whatever that might be, it's pretty clear through those statistics about who is being attracted, into your community, and who is absorbing these units, as they come online. So it's, one of the things that we think about within the housing, chapter is that, again, just like with transportation or with economic development or whatever it might be, you do not exist in a vacuum, right? And thinking about the inflow and the outflow, the daily population here, folks that work in Bluffton but may not live here, folks that live here but work elsewhere. All of these pieces are critical to, I think, to apply to this conversation overall. And the last thing I'll say here, just as a priming piece before we jump into some discussion specific to this chapter, is, one of the canaries in the coal mine that we would look at in terms of just demand. It may sound small, but is just the rental vacancy, within a community. And one of the things I was very, very struck by as we did our analysis in Bluffton, it may not shock you, but it's pretty well close to zero in terms of rental capacity, vacancy or units available. It's fairly consistent, I think, around the low country in terms of it being low, just in terms of there being strong demand, limited supply. But it is that demand and supply question that really, dominated our research and analysis within this section, and what we tried to hit on. And thinking about, too, these questions that arose through public comment and discussion, stakeholder discussion about the idea of affordability. And I think that term sort of broadly applied. Affordability is not a number. It's very relative to the cost of living, cost of housing, volume of units coming on board, whatever that might be. But affordability is a term that has come up quite a bit, I think, in our discussions, and one that I actually believe that you all, actually kind of in the vanguard in communities like your own, in trying to find the right experiments, then trying to invest in those experiments and seeing what you can do to affect what is a very market-led system. So I will shut up now and talk about, maybe we start with this term of build out, what that means. I think we've had some good conversation, about that. And but any thoughts on this housing chapter, what this means, I think, to the quality of life in Bluffton overall?
I mean, since the public has a lot of comments, I'd love to,
You want
that's where
to
I.
start with that?
Yeah.
Carrie, do you want to go ahead and start with the public comments?
Mr. McCracken?
Kyle, we're going to start with public comments before we discuss it.
Sounds great.
Madam Chairperson and members of the commission. I'm Emmett McCracken. I live at 58 Stock Farm Road. I think the chapter on housing covers the total hierarchy of the lexicon of housing, with the exception of no house. There's no mention of homelessness. And I recall, I don't know the magnitude of it, but I know once upon a time, before the front lots in Stock Farm were sold, a gentleman took residence in one of the lots. He made a bed out of palmetto frond and even brought in his own chair. So I know homelessness exists. As I say, I don't know the magnitude. Maybe the police can help us with it. But I think it's something that needs to be recognized in the comprehensive plan, and something that needs to be monitored. At 4:10 this afternoon, I was privy to a conversation, telephonic conversation, from Bluffton to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So you can put 100% reliability in that information. But he mentioned, they mentioned that Beaufort County had developed an office. That Beaufort County does not call it homelessness. They deal in transitional housing, quote unquote, for homeless and needy peoples. And it might be something that staff can make a note of and touch with Beaufort County and see where they are on the subject of homelessness. It's not something that municipalities can solve on their own, but maybe it's something that the county and the municipality can deal with together. So that's something to look at. Kyle mentioned a few minutes ago, this is an entirely different subject. Kyle asked sort of rhetorically, who is coming to Bluffton? And I remember as a pre-teenager, and I don't know whether it still applied, but Bluffton is where the rich come to play, the old come to die, and the poor come to make a living.
Thank you. I think you should put that in there.
You know, there's an interesting statistic I think will play into this. You're talking about population growth here. I think the 2020 census had the town of Bluffton at 29,000 and change. Last month, they released the numbers of population growth between June of 2020 and June of 2021. Bluffton had the most new residents of any city in the state at 3,457 new residents. So we grew by over 10% in 1 year. It's interesting.
Does that shock you? Does that shock you, Commissioner?
A little bit. What shocks me
Yeah.
even more is Hardeeville was not too far behind us, and they don't have the infrastructure we have, and ours needs to be
Right.
improved. So,
Yeah.
not to push it off somewhere else, but it plays into what was mentioned before by Mr. Keel, that we've got to be thinking about what's around us, specifically an area that's going to be growing as much, if not more than us.
Yeah.
And I know we're on housing, so I didn't want to, but the number of new residents that are coming here is why the apartments are all full and why the houses are running a 2-year lead time on building right now.
Well, my housing prices have skyrocketed, which is when you go look at housing prices from a year or two ago, you're talking about a unit that was 300,000 is now 400 to 450,000. I mean, it is just astronomical, the price increase. And that's not affecting just people that are at the bottom 25%. That is affecting 50% of the middle portion of our population base. It is alarming.
Yeah. Commissioner, you got to kind of think about the housing market like a game of tug of rope, right? Where you've got, the pure market on the right side, you've got the forces trying to keep things affordable on the left side. And what we've seen nationally through the pandemic is the right side, the market pull is winning big time. You see a hockey stick phenomenon in those prices in almost any market that I'm working in right now. That includes markets that are challenged, Cleveland, Northeast Ohio, parts of the Chicago metro into Northwest Indiana. Those dynamics are out there everywhere, and they're particularly pernicious in places where there's already strong population growth occurring. So I think if we spend a lot of time within this chapter talking about affordability, it's just because of, some of the issues that we see rising around you.
In 1990, we were ranked 294th in the state as far as size of city. In 2020, we were ranked 25th. Today, we would be ranked around 14th. I don't know if we should be proud of that or scared as,
Can I say something?
Sure, come on up.
I'll just say it from here.
Well, it needs to
Oh, you got it.
For the recording.
all recorded.
Well, and so Kyle can hear
Carmen
too.
Manning, 111 Quarter Casting Circle in Bluffton. And this is just, I sit here and I kind of listen and learn a lot too about this very nice town of Bluffton. But what strikes me is your comments about, what you want from Old Town, what you want there and what you see. And it's almost like you're sitting there not understanding. I'm just a citizen. I'm a taxpayer. I have
We're all
about
just citizens, by the way.
well, no, but you're on the planning commission. I have this much influence, if to do anything. You're the people who can influence this, and you sit there and you sound as hopeless as all the homeowners who say, the PUD, it's in the PUD, nothing you can do. And this is the chance to look at Bluffton, okay? Look at Bluffton today, and where do we want to be in 10 years? Now, if there are things that are constraining that, and we need to identify, all the maps that are in there, the key map is the PUD maps, because if it's true, whatever the number is, it's 92% of the town. The other stuff, I'm sorry, it's like chicken poop, to be frank. The key areas are the 92% that are controlled by the PUDs. What does that plan look like? Is that what we want in 10 years? Is that what we want in 10 years? And if it's not what we want, well, we better start making the changes, whatever changes we need to make in our codes. And I have to tell you, because I've heard it over and over again, there's nothing you can do. Nothing you can do. Well, you know what? I have 35 years in the environmental area, okay? And the only regulation was the 1899 Rivers and Harbors Act. Well, everything changed with the Clean Water Act. Everything changed with NEPA. Everything changed with RECRA. And all the permits that were in place didn't mean anything anymore. And you couldn't put things out in the back 40. And right here in Bluffton, you had to change everything with the hurricanes, right? All the windows, all the standards, all of that, all the code had to change. So this fantasia that nothing we can do about this agreement, go get some good Washington attorneys who will show you the way. Because You people are the ones who are looking at where Bluffton is now, and this document is supposed to say, where do you want to be in 10 years? You are the people who have to decide that. And I don't know why you act like you're helpless to do that. That's number one. And the other comment I have, and this is particular from having spent several hours yesterday trying to get through that land use chapter. Just like you are the important people to decide this, recognize the chumps outside that are paying the taxes. We want to be able to read that document, including the person who's never read it before, and say, well, I'm interested in the schools, I got kids in school. They got to be able to turn open to that page and read it within a couple of minutes and digest what it says. And the same thing with somebody who lives in a PUD that's getting developed. Open up that page and say, okay, yeah, here's my street. And yep, that's the entrance. Oh my goodness, it's saying that we're going to have another 1,000 homes. Okay, and that document, I've never seen anything. So
It's all out there. It's all sitting right on the town website. You can go to any of those PUD documents and look at them. And we've had some good conversations, and we will have some good conversations, but please don't ever think that we're sitting up here saying we're helpless and we're hopeless. We're doing everything we can by the seat of our pants to do the best for the town that we all love living in. And you are not somebody who doesn't have a say-so in this. You've impacted this as much as any of the 5 of us that happen to be sitting up here tonight. We have heard you. We have told staff. Staff has heard you. And we're taking things that you've found that we haven't found into effect and into account in what this document's ending up looking like. You know what tears me apart is the fact that there are
Not many people here.
right,
7 people in this room.
it is awful, and I will tell you what I've learned to do when somebody complains about something. I say, where were you?
Charlie, you're going to show her how to apply for another board, right?
No.
No, but I'm serious. It is frustrating. And it's,
No, I agree, and it's critical because I feel like Bluffton's really at an inflection point. If we don't start addressing the things in 10 years, I don't know if it's going to be as nice. And, sometimes you can just kind of let things go and say, okay, we can wait. I think you're past that point. I think you have to start taking control of the development and what's going on and making sure we have the infrastructure and that we really think through things. That's another thing I see over and over again, just like the numbers in that chart. It's like, how did this get done? And you have to look, you have to uncover that. Like, what didn't they think about there?
But see, that's what we're all doing now.
Yeah,
I
but,
mean,
this
we
should have
had,
been done.
but we weren't involved then. We're getting it now to help facilitate, to get it to where it needs to be for our plan. We didn't write this. This was an outside company that the town hired. We have now had the challenge to go over and review it, which we've all done independently, not in a public forum, at our own private residences or wherever. We've come in public, we've asked for these workshops, because we didn't even have to do any of these workshops, but we requested it so we could have people like you come and voice their opinion and give them the opportunity to help make this better. So it's not just because we didn't do our job,
I'm not saying you didn't
but
do your job.
we are trying to help everyone do the job for the town and help the town grow.
And my point there is, when I came to the first meeting, the very first meeting, okay, the person from the town said, well, we're almost done with this because there's no more budget left. And we got to get this, you got to approve it, and then it's going on the town council. And I sat here.
But that's staff, and that's why we weren't happy with it either. And we're
No,
not
but how
going
did it
to
get that
recommend it.
far?
We can't recommend, because they commissioned this company to do it, and they've given us drafts. The staff reviewed the first, 2 or 3 drafts.
well, we're at the point in the process where it comes to us. It came to us. We weren't happy with it. We weren't satisfied with it. We felt it needed a lot more work, so
This is
And
where
just
we
to
are.
be clear, the first draft we saw is this draft, and we saw it at that meeting,
Yeah.
the very first meeting
You're
that you
seeing what
attended.
we see.
We saw that 2 days before that meeting
And
occurred
that's
for the
fine.
first time.
I'm not
You know what I
blaming,
mean?
believe me, I'm not blaming. I know this has been a very hard.
I don't think
You
we're
didn't-
hearing
you
you
didn't-
blame us, but I think we want you to understand that we have as much care and concern as you do about this, and you have as much care and concern as we do about this, and we're trying to all move forward. This is a much better document than it was 2 months ago, and it's going to be a better document before we hand it on to town council, and town council's still going to have to vet it and go through it. And you know what? We'll probably be there, a couple of us in the audience with you at town council. But you're a part of this process, and we all are doing our best to make it as good as we can. Somebody told me back in 2005, we don't have a choice. The paper mills sold their land, and these PUDs were written. We don't have a choice. The people are coming here. What we need to do is make it the best possible town we can for when they come here. And the people are still coming here. They are. We can't close the gates and keep them from coming here. And I don't think you think that either. Heck, we live, 300 yards from each other? We're right down the road from each other in a new community. But we've got to continue to make this the best that we can possibly make this. And we're trying.
Well,
Well, if you wouldn't mind, Commissioner, I'd like to add to this too. I'm committed to that as well. I mean, I think, what we're describing here tonight, this is all in the spirit of iterating this work. And I've truly appreciated Ms. Manning's comments throughout this on the variety of topics that have come up, and also your time and commitment to this effort. That's not common among communities like yours. So, you're to be commended for this kind of overtime period and the level of attention that you're paying to this. And I truly do appreciate it. We rely on that. If we could, with the time we've got, I would like to talk directly here about some of these housing issues and items that have come up.
Can I ask,
Just
can I
go-
ask real
Yeah, go ahead, I'm
quick?
sorry.
Just if there's anybody else that has a comment real quick about housing before he does his, because we are running out of time. So
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
we went on a tangent.
No, we did. And I was trying to get some data too. Carol Crutchfield, Beaver County School District again. 2 points. One, I want to piggyback on what Mr. McCracken said about homelessness. It should be addressed in your plan to at least be thinking about it. I was trying to get the data real quick. We had 278 students last year who were considered homeless.
Wow.
Now, these aren't people like he was describing, making palm fronds, in a plot of land. These are people who are house surfing, couch surfing, in all kinds of different various situations, but they are technically considered under the McKinney-Vento, they are considered homeless. And so it is something that we try to address as much as we can, but again, affordable housing, available housing is just something we need to all keep in the front. And that affects our teachers as well. One of the things that we often hear is, anecdotally is, we'd love to come teach there, we can't find anything affordable.
Yeah.
So that is some of the feedback we get. Can't quantify that, but if you really want some quantification, reach out and I can try to get that to you. But anyway, it should be as part of your consideration in your plan.
Thank you.
said 278.
Last year. That's district-wide.
I was trying to get that
That's
breakdown if possible, but I haven't gotten a response yet.
So that's students.
That was going to be my question, Carol. I appreciate you clarifying
That
that.
is students, yes, district-wide, yeah.
Is there any other? Go ahead, Ian.
Andrew Keel, 22 Trail Ridge Retreat. He brought up rental. I can tell you in my neighborhood, on my street, there's 3 rental houses. They are all filled by people buying houses that have sold their houses up north, who are temporarily paying $2,500 a month to rent a 2,200 square foot house. And then once their house is done in Sun City, Hardyville, they move into it. So a lot of transient people moving down here are taking up all the rentals because they can afford to. One thing I didn't notice in any of the land use or housing, it's kind of in the housing, but, I don't know if it's, personally, I think we need more commercial, a lot more commercial. I think people probably agree, and infrastructure. However, I I know for like, say, Georgia, they wanted the film industry to show up. So they did a bunch of tax incentives for every movie to get filmed in Atlanta or Georgia. I didn't notice anywhere in there, and maybe it's in the housing portion, maybe we ought to think about giving some sort of tax breaks or something, and I don't know if that's being done, but some sort of fiscal incentive that's potentially more enticing to get the type of development we want. And I'll just leave it at that.
I believe it's in the economy section, just for your.
Is it?
Yeah,
Okay.
we could definitely review that in that session, but it is at least in here.
Okay.
Yeah, Andrew, I think those are good comments related to the market. Obviously there's carrots and sticks, right? And we're always picking which one we're going to use at which moment. And as we think about target sectors or target growth, more and more it's the carrot within the housing market about how do we beat some of just the basic market dynamics, because that's the issue when we talk about affordability is somewhere there's a subsidy, whether it's top down or it's bottom up, you've got to pay for an element to make that piece more affordable. And it's one of the central, again, tug of wars that we deal with here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go to 36 Third Avenue. When we talk about affordability and workforce housing, I think particularly as an architect, affordable housing should be mixed in with the rest of development. You should have a mixed income neighborhood. But a lot of times when we're talking about those kind of things, it comes with a certain density to the development. I think the town has tried some low income, like on Wharf Street, that was single family and it was very nice and I'm sure cost some money, but really built 3 or 4 homes. And I didn't really see any recommendations in this section pertaining to what kind of housing we need and what density that might come at, and whether there's trade-offs the town can take so that we're not just building a whole bunch of single-family neighborhoods that really take up all this space that we're worried about losing the green space. And should we be identifying more dense areas for dense development rather than just all single family? And what should that mix be in the next 10 years?
Yeah.
And where should that be? Yeah.
And where should that be?
And I think when you're talking about 92% of the land mass being in PUDs, I think you have to, and still so much of the density being in the PUDs, I think you have to give strong reason for developers to consider how they can integrate that affordable housing component or work for housing. I know we've currently got some measures in place as the town to promote that, but then we're not seeing developers take it seriously. We're seeing tons of development plans come through and we ask, hey, are you considering affordable housing? They said, nope.
We don't have to.
We don't want to. That's not the product we want. And so how do we make them want it? And I think these developers have a very specific product and a very specific type of development that they're doing. And it's easy for them to sell, and they can basically cookie cutter it. And there's no need for them to even consider, because our incentives just aren't enough to make them think twice about it. So what do we have to do to make them think twice about how they're developing and what they can do to actually come back and bring a master plan before us and say, or PUD amendment, and say, okay, I'm ready to do this because it makes sense for me.
Right thing. Yeah.
I did have another
Carrot and stick.
on that. And it kind of ties into transportation. If you can develop the interconnectivity and more public transportation, might you be able to reduce the parking requirements as a trade-off for, increased units or something on a property where we're kind of stuck with fixed building costs on projects and a certain number of units on a project, and then you kind of get to area when we're planning out projects. It really comes down to how much building can we have and how much parking does that require. And if the town is there a way for town to tackle transportation as potentially something that allows for more density, that you might be able to have a trade-off and convince some developers to do a little bit more low income because they can get a little bit more out of their lot because the town has provided connectivity and transportation might not need as much parking in those areas.
Mr. DePaul, as you well know, just in the last year, construction costs, materials have gone up 28% just in a single year, right? I mean, there's a lot of pressures top down, I think, on that industry to be able to push out, affordable units, especially at scale. And one of the things that actually came up in this discussion around housing, guys, that I thought was quite interesting is this idea of, NOAA housing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, but, naturally occurring affordable housing, meaning so much of our discussion, around this topic is the idea of adding units, right, every year. But there's very little attention paid to the fragility of existing affordable units, that again may have just been given to you by years of development. And I think as we think about this plan, maybe deviating a little bit from some of the conversation that's occurred in your community over the last 10 or 15 years dealing with this topic, that idea of protecting at the bottom those units from either redevelopment, absorption, lowercase g, I would say gentrification, meaning just say sort of the tidal raises in value that would price someone out, that become a pretty important part of this discussion. And I think at minimum, it's the idea of knowing what's out there. That's a key piece. And when you know it, then you can take steps to, whether it's protect, that might be a hard first step, or provide tools. And we've already done a number of those steps as well.
Another thing that I think, I'm going to say, go ahead, since I got the floor. One of the things I think that also needs to be looked at, and I'm not sure that this chapter has really gotten into, is this idea of stepping out of that. It mentions it briefly. I don't want to say that it didn't. I don't want to give you credit where you do have credit, or take away credit. But just coming in for these affordable housing units, and then one of the things that my husband and I looked at years ago when we bought our first house, we looked at those affordable housing units on Wharf Street, and we ended up at Bluffton Park because, one, I could get the money out of my house when I sold it, which I couldn't get out of the affordable housing. And I actually had more land and more house. And so it makes me beg the question of how affordable are we really making our affordable housing when the town becomes the developer. And two, then when you talk about this affordable housing being set up as they take a portion of the profits, or I don't get to take the profits, or I have to be in this house for a certain period of time before I can take the profits, it limits my ability to upgrade to my next house. And even now, I'm still kind of limited in upgrading to my next house because the housing prices are so crazy. And so nobody can upgrade into my house because I can't upgrade into another house. And so you have this kind of blockade in the stair-stepping process, and how do we best equip people to go from coming into these affordable housings to the next step so that they have that profit coming off of it to invest in the next piece.
Yeah. Commissioner, I think you bring up an interesting comment that I heard, I think, from several folks in your community as we had this discussion, which is the idea of, can I afford to buy another house in Bluffton? Can I afford to buy my next house here, right? That's an interesting dynamic, especially for community members that may not be as long-lived as, some of the commissioners here, some of the audience members in the community, meaning 10, 20, 30 years. But even in 7 years of home ownership there, and how much the dynamics and price have changed, have they been priced down essentially? You're right. And I think when we talk about this kind of, again, it's that tug of war deal, right? As the rope moves, it moves for everybody. So these questions become difficult for each segment along the way. They're most difficult for what Mr. McCracken brings up when we talk about those that are housing secure, insecure, or indeed unhoused. Those are very critical pieces, but it's also important at each segment to recognize how that's changing.
Are there any other public comments that want to speak about it? Okay. I want to continue. Anybody else? Kathleen, you have some more notes?
I think for me, one of the other comments that I had was just this idea of how do we compare. I know you included Beaufort County as a part of your comparison and some of your aspects and some of that with also South Carolina as a whole. But communities of us, similar coastal communities. And I think this actually kind of goes back to your other question when it came to land uses, what do we want to look like? But I think when we start looking at how and it's hard because like, Commissioner Whitmer said, we've grown astronomically and people are coming here and they are coming here. So there's very few coastal towns in our state that are experiencing the same kind of pressures we are. But I think that we do need to be looking at how much, when you're talking about we're making $80,000 a year on average and our home costs start at $300,000, you just have such a disparate, that's not the right word. Anyway, it's just a big difference, and math doesn't make sense. And so when you start looking at other communities and what that balance looks like, if we're talking about a balanced town and a balanced economy and a balance in housing, what does a balanced housing look like in another community? What community has that going on for them? And how do we compare and stack up and measure?
Yeah. Commissioner, real quick on that point, I meant what I said in terms of you all, vanguard's a weird word, but I think kind of being on the edge of experimentation when you talk about what you've tried to do to address this issue. And, as you look around the community, around the country, this is a nut that no one's cracked, right? Especially in places that people want to be. But I do believe that there are, potentially some examples from communities like yours. And I think we've got to kind of get out of maybe South Carolina to look more at destinations that have similar market conditions to you all. And I think maybe adding a couple of those pieces into maybe our graphics or figure comparisons would be helpful to show, the type of trends that you're experiencing, what other communities have done, maybe perhaps.
And I think also, and that also translates to even what percentage we have. I think it stays in here. We have something like 80% single family detached. And so we're still looking at 20% of the other market. How does that compare with other towns? What should we be shooting for? And how do we know we've reached the benchmark?
It's actually a pretty significant mix, honestly, Commissioner. That's what's interesting. For communities like yours, that number of 80% single family detached is actually quite low. It's more typical to see that much higher. And I think that probably has a lot to do with the planned communities and the sort of the diversity of housing products within those. But we talk a lot about housing, guys, about this idea of missing middle, those unit, that kind of that set of products between single family detached and, large scale multifamily 20 unit development properties, that really being a key stepping stone for affordability, for home ownership, for access, for workforce housing, for writ large. Now, it's still hard to build that even cheaply, new build, right? But that product, that does exist in Bluffton, and it's actually quite a unique aspect of your housing profile.
So when you're
Any other? Go ahead.
When you're referring to the missing middle housing, you're saying we do have it, and we even have it possibly to a comparable amount of what other towns are providing. It's just that we still need more. Is that the directive you're making?
What I'm saying is that I think the idea that introducing missing middle as a catch-all solution for housing affordability challenges writ large is a bit kind of overplayed, because what that can ignore is just the incredible desirability of the market itself, meaning the accommodation within those units, right? So, a duplex can be anything, right? It can be where I lived in college, all the way up to some of the units that you find on Hilton Head Island or beyond, right? I think the product itself doesn't always speak to either the quality or the level of investment into the unit. Now, what I will say though is, the smaller the floor plate, tends to be this, the more affordable the units. And what some communities have gotten into a bad habit of is really only zoning and permitting for single-family detached housing. I work in one community I won't name right now, whose score in that particular one we just brought up is 98%. 98% of those of their 15,000 housing units is just one type, right? And where that becomes vulnerable is that is a very elastic piece when we have market pressure, especially for housing costs, right? As housing costs rise, single family detached prices rise quickly. They drive a lot of that. So I bring that up just as an idea that there are areas where you've got advantages, and it's interesting to see. And I'm sorry to tack on this. You can tell I love this subject, but the naturally affordable, a naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA, you're going to see a large overlap between those products and those product types that are in that missing middle category. They may be modular homes, they may be quads or triplexes, but they're a kind of a forgotten type of building that we have in the housing market, especially nationwide.
Here's where my struggle is. I can see we have currently a major issue with a lack of supply for the demand that we have and the demand we have coming. And I'm sensing an unclear, I'm unclear on the messaging in terms of, I hear protect your naturally affordable housing. You've got a good mix. And so what I'm not hearing is, but you need to, your supply is, we've got this many undeveloped units. Should we be shooting to build those faster? And move that through quicker? I mean, what solutions do we have to meet the demand? I mean, we have a major problem on our hand right now, and I foresee that being the issue for the next 10 years. How do we solve that, and where is that in here?
Yeah. Well, I would say, one commissioner, this is a regional challenge, and it's not for you to solve, independently of your partners, around the Low Country. And I think, as some of these organizations have begun to grow and flower around you, they're trying to tackle this issue. I think there's an acknowledgement that you're dealing in a system. Now, do you have a role to play? Certainly. And I keep harping on this idea that you've developed a lot of kind of the early structure, infrastructure to be able to start to have some of these conversations. But at the end of the day, if you want to build affordable housing, you've got to build affordable housing, right? So whatever that mechanism is, whether it's through subsidy or it's through top-down regulation, I think the directive that would come out of this is that this community needs to have that conversation around, how serious are we, how committed are we to this challenge, and how will we, put money, quite frankly, resources, or draft fairly strong language for new development as it occurs that says that we will require, X% units to hit a certain AMI. Hit a certain mark. That's certainly what other communities have cleared the way for you on that. That comes with its own challenges. Just in terms of devoting resources to it, comes at its own challenge. But I think the interpretation of action beyond here is, it really is a conversation that I think really needs to continue to flower, both regionally and then within that building you're in right now.
I also think there's a challenge because when you look at that 2040 Beaufort County comp plan, they're saying, we know all these people are coming, and there's all these PUDs that are undeveloped in Bluffton, and we anticipate they're going there. So while I understand, yes, we have regional partners that we need to be reaching out to and talking and be sitting at the table with, they're expecting us to take the bulk of the new development, and our infrastructure isn't suitable for it. And right now we're already feeling an economic pressure associated with this. I mean, there's got to be some real hard looks at the solutions to this situation, and not just an analysis, not just an inventory, not just an analysis, but some real plans about how we're going to, I go back to, I understand this is not just an us problem, but it is a heavily us problem. Mm-hmm. Hilton Head's basically built out. it's fallen on us. I mean, like Hardyville's gonna, like Mr. Keel said, Hardyville's only gonna add to the infrastructure pressures just from a commercial standpoint, if for nothing else. Not even just a school or sewer, water, electric. We've got a major problem coming down the pipeline. And it's already here.
I have a general question, you guys might know. Andrew Keel, 22 Trail Ridge Retreat. When I was in Atlanta, guy's office next to me was a builder, and I asked him, and this was like 2018, he was building houses in Atlanta, spec houses, and I asked him how much it cost a square foot to build a house. He said $85 a square foot in Atlanta in 2018. I'm curious if anybody knows what it is now in Bluffton?
300 to 400, isn't it?
300 to 400 a square foot to build a house?
I got lucky. I built for less than 200 a square foot 4 years ago, and that was.
Depends on what neighborhood.
Well, I mean, when I moved here, I paid $85 a square foot for my house in 2017. So you're telling me it's $300 a square foot to build a house right now? All right. I forgot my other question.
That would make you forget, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was going to mention, infrastructure-wise, I don't know if Mr. Planner knows, but I know you guys know because I've told you multiple times. My electric goes out almost every week. So we don't have, the grid can't handle what's coming in. My next question is, does anybody know what is actually approved to be built right now in like New Riverside in terms of all the developments that have been approved to actually, let me clarify, not what's been approved to be built, but what has actually got like a development permit that there will be built in the next, say, 6 months?
That, if you go to the website, you can find it, or if you can go there, I mean, everything's on there on that map. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say they.
Town of Bluffton.
Town of Bluffton's
Town of Bluffton
website.
has everything.
The building department releases a list of the permits that's issued every
Tell the
month.
number of the houses?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I will say, we can't do this in a normal planning commission meeting, but this is a workshop. We are constrained. If the developer gives us a letter from the utilities that says we can provide the electric, we can provide the internet, we can provide the phone service, as long as that letter is in there, unfortunately, that's what we're legally bound to. And that particular power company just seems to have problems.
Well,
I'm glad I'm with
what do
the
we
other
do?
one.
We're good.
The substation coming.
Yeah, if it were me, I would hound them every single day. I would. I had problems in 2005 when I was in Pine Ridge with them.
Yeah.
I hate it.
You know, the utility letter, I think, for Midpoint, the one in their packet wasn't for electricity, it was for gas.
You know, I didn't look close enough.
Yeah, so I don't know how they're gonna get gas there because our subdivision doesn't have gas, so I guess they're gonna run it specially to them.
They're gonna run it through Trail Ridge Drive? No, I'm kidding. Sorry.
They probably will.
Just say your name, it's fine.
Joe DePaul, 36 3rd Avenue. I understand that all of these sections intermingle and relate to each other. And I'm sure the commissioners would agree with me in saying that this seems like the section to set some specific goals for town staff to aim at and use to make decisions on the other sections going forward. What is a specific number of affordable housing we think we need, or what should that percentage be in a year, so that year over year we can take a look and see if we've met that or if we're trending in that direction, and make some decisions on what might need to happen on all of those other sections to help work towards that goal, because it does seem to be one of our most particular problems we're working on.
And everybody keeps coming. It's not going to stop. Okay. You want to wrap up? Kyle? Can you hear us, Kyle? You lose him?
Kyle, I think we're wrapping up.
Well,
think
you're
you're
on
muted.
mute. Or,
Somebody give them hand motions.
Am I muted?
can you hear us?
Oh, I'm sorry. And you may hear my 3-year-old screaming here in just a second. I apologize. But yeah, Joe, I appreciate the comment, regarding the specific goals. Obviously, that's something that, communities like you around the country have set some pretty bold targets, I think, in that area, whether it's in a unit count, it's a percentage, or it's, an agreement among, kind of your regional partners or system to collectively address this and what your role within that addressing might be. But, guys, I appreciate the extra time here in working through this. This is extremely helpful, I think, to me and to our team. And as I keep using this word, iterating this document and getting it closer. And as Commissioner, you pointed out, more a second ago, better and better through each conversation. So we're going to keep working at that. We've got 2 more topics coming up this week with natural resources and resiliency. Really excited to dig into some of those topics, especially with resiliency, as that is a new component that we're dealing with during this round. So, are there any other questions process-wise for me, commissioners, or Charlotte, before I step out?
I think everybody's pretty good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, with that, may I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, Kyle.